2022. In a single year, more Americans die from a drug overdose than the United States lost in the entire Vietnam War. Roughly 110,000 people, gone in 12 months. That's a sold-out Michigan stadium, the biggest football stadium in America, wiped off the map, every seat and a couple thousand more on top of it. Most of them died with the same chemical in their blood, and that chemical comes, in the end, from one flower. A pretty thing with papery petals in white and pink and purple. A flower that farmers have grown for 6,000 years. It is sitting in your medicine cabinet right now, under names you'd recognize on a pharmacy label. The story of how it got there runs through more empires, more wars, and more deliberate lies than almost anything else human beings have ever put in their bodies. This is where it begins. Go back more than 5,000 years, before there was a Rome, before there was an Egypt anyone would recognize, to the flat river country of southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. The Sumerians are living there, inventing writing, inventing cities, inventing the idea of writing things down so they don't get forgotten. And on some of the oldest clay tablets human beings ever made, scholars found a symbol for a plant. The best reading of it, and this one is still argued over, translates to hulgil, the joy plant. That flower was the opium poppy, Papaver somniferum, and people were already growing it before the pyramids. Here's the part that should stop you cold. Farmers were cultivating this flower on purpose, planting it, tending it, harvesting it, more than 5,000 years before the United States existed as a country. When the first American colonists stepped off their boats, this plant already had a resume longer than all of recorded Western history. The poppy didn't come from Iraq alone. Archaeologists have pulled poppy seeds and dried seed pods out of Stone Age settlements across southern Europe, lakeside villages in what's now Switzerland and Italy, caves in Spain, going back 6,000 years and more. Ancient people carried this flower with them, buried it with their dead, and pressed its capsules into the dirt of half a continent. It spread across an area bigger than the entire American Southwest before anyone wrote a word about it. Now picture the harvest, because this is the piece the modern world forgot. It's just before dawn, somewhere in the ancient Near East. A farmer walks out into a field of poppies, and the light is still grey, and the flowers have already dropped their petals. What's left is a green seed pod about the size of a walnut, standing up on its stalk. The farmer takes a small blade and draws it shallowly across the skin of that pod. Not deep, just enough to open it, and the pod bleeds. A thick white milk wells up out of the cut, slow as sap. By the time the sun is fully up, that white milk has dried on the surface of the pod into a sticky brown gum, and the farmer scrapes it off with the edge of the blade, working pod by pod, hunched over, the sweet vegetable bitterness of it on the fingers. That brown gum is raw opium, and that patient, pre-dawn, hand-scraping ritual, pod by pod, drop by drop, is essentially how the poppy was harvested for thousands of years in fields from Anatolia to India, long before anyone understood the first thing about what it was actually doing inside the human brain. Every paragraph of the ancient world seems to have a poppy in it. In Egypt, a medical scroll from around 1550 BC, the Ebers Papyrus, lists a poppy remedy to quiet crying children. The Greeks gave us the word we still use, opium, poppy juice, which became opium. They carved poppies into statues of Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Morpheus, the god of dreams. And hold on to that name, Morpheus, because it comes back later with a body count. To the ancients, this flower was a gift and a mystery all at once. It killed pain, it brought sleep, it brought dreams, and if you took too much, it brought a sleep you didn't wake up from. They knew that. They just couldn't resist it. For most of human history, that's what opium was. Medicine, ritual, a little brown gum scraped off a pod at dawn, traded in small amounts, treated with respect and fear. Then a handful of civilizations figured out how to turn it into money. For centuries, opium moved on the same roads as silk and spice. Arab traders and physicians during the great age of Islamic science studied it, wrote it into their medical books, and carried it east along the trade routes, into Persia, into India, and eventually all the way to China, hundreds of years before any Englishman thought to sell it there. To the doctors of that world, opium was the crown jewel of the medicine chest, the one drug that reliably did what it promised. It stopped pain, it stopped coughs, it stopped the kind of dysentery that emptied villages. In an age when most so-called medicine was educated guessing, opium actually worked, and everyone who touched it knew it. Europe caught the fever late and caught it hard. In the 1500s, a wild, brilliant Swiss physician known as Paracelsus dissolved opium in alcohol and gave the tincture a name that would haunt pharmacies for 400 years. Laudanum. A century later, an English doctor named Thomas Sydenham perfected the recipe and promoted it so relentlessly that he reportedly called opium the closest thing God had given mankind to ease its suffering. Coming from the most respected physician in England, that was about as good as a blessing from the pulpit. So opium went mainstream. By the 1700s, laudanum sat in nearly every European and American household, the way a bottle of ibuprofen sits in yours. It was cheap, often cheaper than a bottle of gin, and it needed no prescription and no explanation. Mothers dosed teething babies with it. Poets wrote under it. Laborers swallowed it for the aches of brutal work. And quietly, steadily, a share of them couldn't stop. Nobody called it addiction. They called it a habit, or a need, or bad nerves. Lock in the pattern right here, because it repeats through this entire story. Every single time human beings have gotten their hands on this flower, they've started by calling it a miracle, and only admitted the trap once the bodies were impossible to ignore. A bottle of laudanum in a farmhouse, though, is a private tragedy. What came next turned the poppy into something else entirely, a weapon of state, aimed by the richest empire on earth at the largest nation on earth. And Americans got rich helping pull the trigger. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shaped the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between, I always want to know. Now meet the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen. The British East India Company. This wasn't a company the way we think of one. It had its own army, a private army bigger than most nations, its own navy, its own courts. It ran India like a business, and it had a problem that came straight out of a story you may already know. The British were addicted to tea, not the drug, the drink. They bought oceans of it from China, and they paid for it in silver, and China wanted nothing from Britain in return. So British silver kept flowing east into China and never came back. It was bleeding the empire dry. The East India Company found the fix, and the fix was the flour. Here's how the machine worked. The company forced hundreds of thousands of Indian farmers in Bengal and Bihar to tear out their food crops and grow opium poppies instead, under contract, at prices the company set, whether the farmer liked it or not. The company processed that opium in enormous factories, packed it into chests, and sold it to smugglers who ran it into China, where selling it was illegal. The silver the company earned poisoning China then paid for the tea going back to London. It was a closed loop, and the fuel was human addiction. The distances alone should tell you how badly the British wanted this. The opium pipeline ran from the poppy fields of northern India, down the rivers, out to the coast, and across open ocean to the southern coast of China. A sea route longer than a coast-to-coast American road trip from New York City to Los Angeles. And they ran it, year after year, chest after chest, because the money was almost unimaginable. At its peak, opium made up as much as 1/6 of the entire revenue of British India. Think about what that means. Imagine if 1 out of every $6 the United States government collected came from selling a single addictive drug into a country where it was banned. That was the business model of the world's leading empire, and Americans were in it up to their necks. This is the part that never makes it into the polite version. When the British opened the China opium trade, American merchants sprinted in behind them. The biggest American firm in China, Russell and Company, made a fortune running opium, Turkish opium mostly, to dodge the British monopoly on the Indian stuff. And one of the young Americans who got rich doing it was a man named Warren Delano Jr. He built the family fortune on the China opium trade, came home wealthy, and passed that money down through his family. His grandson grew up to be President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Read that again. The money behind one of the most famous families in American political history was, in part, opium money. This isn't a foreign story you can hold at arm's length. American clipper ships, American merchants, and American fortunes were woven into the opium trade from the beginning. Delano had plenty of company. A whole generation of American merchant princes, a lot of them out of Boston, built their family fortunes in the China trade, and opium money seeded banks, railroads, hospitals, and universities, whose names you'd still recognize on buildings today. The men doing it didn't picture themselves as drug dealers. They pictured themselves as respectable businessmen taking advantage of a legal opportunity abroad. That distinction has always mattered enormously to the people making the money, and never once to the people on the receiving end. When China finally tried to shut it down, when a Chinese official seized and destroyed a mountain of British opium in 1839, Britain went to war to keep the drugs flowing. Twice. The Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, ended with China forced to open its ports, hand over Hong Kong, and swallow the trade at gunpoint. An empire went to war to protect its right to sell an addictive flower to somebody else's people. And the people paying the real price weren't in London, and they weren't in Boston. They were in the fields, and they were in the opium dens. Let's go there next. Somebody had to grow all that opium. Somebody had to process it, and the conditions were their own kind of hell. Walk into the East India Company's great opium factory at Ghazipur on the Ganges in northern India. For a time, the largest opium factory on earth, a complex sprawling across grounds you could lose a small town in. Inside, the air is so thick with the sweet, heavy, sickening smell of raw opium that visitors said it made their heads swim just standing in the doorway. Now put yourself on the floor of it. A worker, barefoot, stripped down in the heat, steps into a wide vat filled with raw opium and begins to tread it, mixing it with his own feet the way you'd stomp grapes, hour after hour, so it reaches an even consistency. Another man sits and rolls the opium into cannonball-sized cakes, thousands of them, wrapping each one in a shell of dried poppy petals, his hands stained brown to the wrist. The fumes never stop, the smell never leaves your clothes. Men who worked those floors breathed the drug all day, every day, for wages that barely kept them alive, so that a company in London could turn their labor into silver. And that was the easy end of the pipeline. The hard end was in China, where the opium landed. By the 1830s, historians estimate somewhere between 10 and 12 million Chinese people were addicted. Whole stretches of the country organized their lives around the pipe. Families sold everything they owned. Men lay in dim rooms for days at a time, wasting away, unable to work, unable to leave. Picture losing everyone in a city the size of Los Angeles to a single addiction, and then losing them again, generation after generation, for the better part of a century. That's the scale of what the trade did to China. Step into one of those rooms for a second. It's dim, the windows shuttered against the daylight, the air thick and sweet and sour with smoke. A man lies on his side on a low wooden platform, a long pipe held over a small oil lamp, a bead of opium bubbling and hissing at the tip as he draws the smoke down deep and holds it. His eyes go half-lidded. The ache of his whole life, the debt, the hunger, the endless labor, slides off him for a few hours. Then it comes back, and he needs the pipe again, and a little more than last time, and slowly the rest of his life reorganizes itself around that platform and that lamp until there's nothing left of it. That scene didn't stay in China. It came home. Chinese laborers carried the pipe to America in the 1800s, and opium dens opened in San Francisco, in New York, in mining towns across the West. In 1875, San Francisco passed an ordinance banning those dens, the first anti-drug law in United States history. It was aimed squarely at Chinese immigrants, soaked in racial panic, and it barely slowed the drug at all. But it set the template America would follow for the next century and a half. Treat the poppy as somebody else's vice, somebody else's people, right up until it's your own family in the room. Here's the direct line to your living room. This entire system existed to feed Western appetite. British teacups, British account books, and yes, American merchant fortunes were the reason those poppies got planted at all. The demand started in the comfortable parlors of the West. The suffering got exported to the fields of India and the back rooms of Canton. Quick question. How many opioid prescriptions do you think American pharmacies filled in a single year at the peak of the modern crisis? Not over a lifetime. In 1 year. Take a guess and drop it in the comments right now. I'll give you the real number before we're done, and I promise it's bigger than you think. Because here's the twist. Everything you just heard was the old world. Poppies, pipes, smugglers, empires. The modern opioid crisis, the one killing Americans right now, didn't come from a smuggler. It came from a laboratory, and it came wrapped in the language of healing. In 1804, a young German pharmacist's apprentice named Friedrich Serturner did something nobody had ever done. Working in a small town shop, he pulled a single pure chemical out of raw opium. The active ingredient. The thing that actually did the work. He'd isolated the first alkaloid ever extracted from a plant, a landmark in the history of science. And because it brought on such deep, dreamlike sleep, he named it after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. He called it morphine. Morphine was 10 times stronger than raw opium and endlessly easier to measure and ship. Doctors thought they'd been handed a miracle. Then came a second invention that turned the miracle into a trap, the hypodermic needle, refined in the 1850s. Now you could put pure morphine directly into a person's bloodstream, and the relief was instant, total, and, nobody wanted to admit this yet, ferociously addictive. America got its crash course during the Civil War. Picture a field hospital behind the lines, 1863. The tent is full. A soldier is brought in with a leg torn apart by a Minié ball, screaming, and there is no time and no comfort and almost nothing anyone can do, except this. A surgeon presses morphine into the wound or slides a needle under the skin, and within moments the screaming stops. The boy's face goes slack with relief. In a war that maimed hundreds of thousands, that mercy was everything. The Union Army handed out an estimated 10 million opium pills and hundreds of thousands of ounces of other opium preparations over the course of the war. Then the war ended, and the soldiers went home, and a lot of them couldn't stop. Morphine addiction became so common among veterans that people started calling it the soldier's disease. Historians still argue about exactly how widespread it was, but nobody argues that a generation of American men came home from that war hooked. And here's where America went truly wild, because in the late 1800s, there were no rules at all. There was no FDA. There was no prescription required. Opium and morphine were poured into hundreds of products and sold openly to anyone with a coin. You could order syringes and narcotics straight out of the Sears, Roebuck catalog and have them mailed to your farmhouse. Pharmacies sold laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, for coughs, for female troubles, for nerves. And in one of the darkest corners of the whole story, a wildly popular product called Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was marketed to mothers to quiet teething babies. Its active ingredient was morphine. It calmed the babies, all right. Some of them it calmed forever. Then, in 1898, a German company you buy from today put the cherry on top. The Bayer company, yes, the aspirin people, began selling a brand new, souped-up opioid it had synthesized in the lab. Bayer marketed it as a powerful cough suppressant, safe for the whole family, and even promoted it as a cure for morphine addiction. A non-addictive replacement, they claimed. They gave it a heroic-sounding trade name. They called it heroin. Sit with that. One of the most addictive substances ever created was sold over the counter in America as a family cough remedy and a treatment for the addiction it actually caused. That was the false dawn. The world genuinely believed for a moment that science had tamed the poppy, that it had all the good and none of the harm. It hadn't. As the bodies piled up, the United States finally started building fences. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 forced companies to at least list narcotics on the label. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 clamped down on who could sell opium and its cousins at all. Heroin was banned outright. For most of the 20th century, doctors grew genuinely afraid of these drugs and prescribed strong opioids carefully, mostly for the dying and the badly injured. The lesson looked learned. The poppy looked caged. What I haven't told you yet is what the people selling you these drugs already knew when they decided to open that cage again. On purpose, for money, in American boardrooms. And they've known it for decades. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't the story you were told. Do me one favor. Hit subscribe. It's the single thing that helps these deep dives reach more people. Okay, back to it. Because this next part is where it stops being history and starts being about you. In 1996, a privately held pharmaceutical company based in Stamford, Connecticut, Purdue Pharma, owned by a family named Sackler, launched a new painkiller. Its active ingredient was OxyContin, a close chemical cousin of the same molecule scraped off those poppy pods 6,000 years ago. Purdue put it in a time-release pill and gave it a name that's now infamous, OxyContin. The pitch was the false dawn all over again, dressed up for the 1990s. Purdue told doctors that because the pill released its dose slowly over 12 hours, it was far less likely to be abused or to hook patients. The company trained an army of sales reps and sent them into doctors' offices across the country with a single reassuring message repeated over and over. The risk of addiction is very low, less than 1%. Where did that number come from? This is the part that should make you angry. It came from a 5-sentence letter to the editor published in a medical journal back in 1980. Not a study, not a clinical trial, a short letter about hospital patients. Purdue and the broader painkiller industry took that one paragraph and inflated it into a national marketing campaign, waving it around as proof that these pills were safe for millions of Americans with ordinary aches. A single letter turned into a permission slip to flood the country. And the government that was supposed to catch it didn't. The FDA approved OxyContin's original label with language suggesting the slow-release design was believed to reduce the drug's appeal to abusers, a claim that helped Purdue sell it as safer. The FDA official who oversaw that approval left the agency not long after and went to work for Purdue. Regulator 1 year, employee of the company he'd just regulated the next. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the revolving door, and it's spun in broad daylight. Now, the honest part. I went looking for a single smoking gun memo where executives wrote down, "We know this is killing people and we're going to keep selling it anyway." People imagine a document like that exists. I'm not going to invent one for you. But here's the thing. You don't need it, because the arithmetic tells the whole story on its own. OxyContin generated somewhere around $30 to $35 billion in revenue over its life. $35 billion off one pill. Court records later showed that between 2008 and 2016 alone, the Sackler family pulled more than $10 billion out of the company. And in 2007, 9 years after launch, with the damage already visible, Purdue and 3 executives pleaded guilty in federal court to misleading the public about the drug's risks. The penalty was around $600 million. Do the math a company does. $600 million in fines against $35 billion in sales. That's not a punishment. That's a rounding error. That's a cost of doing business. They knew what the fine was. They knew what the revenue was, and they kept going. The FDA had signed off. The sales reps kept knocking. The pills kept flowing. And a molecule from a flower older than civilization went to work on the American body at a scale no empire, no smuggler, no war had ever managed. The pills went everywhere the money would carry them. Through the 2000s, shady pain clinics, pill mills, sprang up across the country, and Florida turned into the national supermarket. With no statewide system to track prescriptions, Florida doctors handed out OxyContin by the fistful, and people drove hundreds of miles up Interstate 75 from Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio to load up. The route earned its own grim nickname, the Oxy Express. You could fill a bottle in a Florida strip mall clinic and sell those same pills back home for 10, 20, 30 times what you paid. Then in 2010, under mounting pressure, Purdue reformulated OxyContin so the pills were harder to crush and abuse. On paper, a victory. In the real world, it shoved hundreds of thousands of people who were already hooked off the pills and straight onto something cheaper, stronger, and sold on any street corner. Heroin. Same flower, same molecule, a couple of chemical steps meaner. Researchers traced the same ugly line over and over. The crackdown on pills didn't cure the addiction, it just changed the label on the bottle. And the dying sped up. A company doesn't sell that many pills alone. It builds a machine to keep the truth quiet. And Purdue's machine was very American. The industry funded patient advocacy groups that pushed the idea that American doctors were cruelly undertreating pain, that the real crisis was people suffering without enough pills, not too many. Pain got rebranded as the fifth vital sign, something every doctor was now supposed to measure and treat aggressively. Industry money flowed to medical education, to friendly researchers, to the conferences where doctors learned what to prescribe. When patients showed signs of addiction, sales materials floated a tidy euphemism. Call it pseudo-addiction. And the answer was often to prescribe more. It was the tobacco playbook, run on painkillers. Fund the science you like, drown out the science you don't, and buy time. And Purdue never operated alone in a vacuum. Behind the pill mills and the pharmacies stood a handful of enormous American corporations most people have never heard of. The drug distributors, the middlemen who move the pills from factory to pharmacy counter. 3 companies you've never thought about, McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen, control the overwhelming majority of that pipeline. And they poured opioids into the country by the hundreds of millions. Nowhere shows it like West Virginia. Between 2007 and 2012, distributors shipped more than 780 million hydrocodone and OxyContin pills into that one small state. 433 pills for every man, woman, and child living in it. In the town of Kermit, population around 400, a single pharmacy took delivery of nearly 9 million opioid pills in 2 years. Run that number. That's more than 11,000 pills for every single person in town. Nobody anywhere along that supply chain picked up a phone to ask the obvious question because the obvious question was bad for business. And when the one federal agency that could have slammed the brakes on it tried to, the DEA, Congress helped tie its hands. In 2016, lawmakers quietly passed a bill, greased by industry money, that stripped the DEA of much of its power to freeze suspicious opioid shipments. A veteran DEA official named Joe Ranazzisi, who'd spent years going after the distributors, went public on 60 Minutes and in the Washington Post and said flat out that Congress had just protected the companies flooding America with pills. He was pushed out of his job. The pills kept moving. And the bill for all that quiet is still landing on American kitchen tables. Since 1999, roughly 800,000 Americans have died from opioid overdoses, and the total drug overdose death toll since then runs to about 1.3 million. Line up just the opioid deaths, and you've got more people than live in San Francisco gone. The crisis moved in waves. First, the prescription pills. Then when authorities finally cracked down and cut people off, many of them turned to heroin, and then to illicit fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that a lethal dose can be smaller than a pinch of salt. Prescription opioid deaths in America peaked at over 17,000 in a single year in 2017. Then fentanyl took the wheel and the numbers got worse. At the very worst of it, in 2022, the country lost more than 110,000 people to drug overdoses in 1 year. That Michigan stadium from the top of this video. Overdose became the leading cause of death for American adults under 45. Not car crashes, not guns. This, the reckoning, when it finally came from Americans who refused to let it go. Investigative reporters at the Los Angeles Times and elsewhere dug into what Purdue knew and when. Authors like Barry Meyer, Sam Quinones, and Patrick Radden Keefe put the Sackler name on the front of books and the front of the national conscience. Museums that had proudly hung the Sackler name over their galleries in New York, in Washington, quietly took it down. State after state hauled the company into court. Purdue filed for bankruptcy in 2019, buried under thousands of lawsuits. And here's the freshest turn, the one most people still don't know. In 2021, a court approved a settlement that would have shielded the Sackler family from future opioid lawsuits. And in June 2024, the United States Supreme Court threw it out, ruling that a family that never declared bankruptcy couldn't buy itself blanket immunity. So they went back to the table. In late 2025, a federal judge confirmed a new deal, roughly $7.4 billion, with the Sacklers paying up to $7 billion of it over 15 years, stripped of their ownership and permanently barred from selling opioids in the United States. Purdue itself is being turned into a new company aimed at fighting the very crisis it helped start. And Purdue is only the most famous name on the list. The distributors and the other drug makers have paid out their own settlements. The big three distributors alone agreed to roughly $21 billion, and the total across all the opioid lawsuits in America has climbed toward $50 billion. That's a staggering number until you set it next to the death toll, at which point it starts to look like exactly what the fines always looked like: the cost of doing business. West Virginia, the state that got buried in pills, still carries the highest overdose death rate in the country. Purdue knew what it was selling. 1996. They knew. And the machine kept running for the better part of 30 years, while Americans paid the price in the one currency that never comes back. So here's the number I promised you. At the peak, in 2012, pharmacies in the United States filled about 255 million opioid prescriptions in a single year. 255 million. That's enough pill bottles for 4 out of every 5 adults in the entire country to be holding one at the same time. If your guess up in the comments was anywhere close, you were paying closer attention than most of America was at the time. The flower never left, it just changed its clothes. Opioids are still one of the most widely prescribed classes of drugs in the country, sitting on the shelves behind the counter at your CVS, your Walgreens, your Walmart pharmacy, your Costco. They're in the little orange bottle in your medicine cabinet after a root canal or a torn-up knee. Hydrocodone, OxyContin, the same molecule, the same flower. Cross into the illegal supply, and fentanyl is now laced into counterfeit pills and street drugs from coast to coast, which is why the crisis, even now, is still killing tens of thousands of Americans a year. There is, finally, some real light. In 2024, American overdose deaths fell by nearly 27%, the steepest single-year drop ever recorded, down to about 80,000, and provisional numbers for 2025 show them falling again towards 70,000. A big part of that is a small nasal spray you can now buy over the counter at that same drugstore, naloxone, brand name Narcan, which yanks a person back from an overdose in minutes. 6,000 years after a farmer first scored a poppy pod at dawn, we're finally learning to pull people out of the flower's grip. But we are still climbing out of a hole this deep only because it was dug this deep on purpose. Slow down with me for the last minute, because this is the part that matters. The whole arc of the poppy is really one question asked over and over across 6,000 years. What happens when something that genuinely heals is also something you can sell? Every single time, the Sumerian priest, the British Empire, the biochemist, the Connecticut boardroom, the same fork in the road showed up. On one side, careful medicine that eases real suffering. On the other, a fortune waiting for anyone willing to look away from what the drug does to the person taking it. And America, the country that promises transparency and fair markets and the right to know what's being done to you, keeps choosing the fortune quietly, in rooms you were never invited into. A 5-sentence letter became a marketing slogan. A regulator became an employee. A family became billionaires. And you found out years later, if you found out at all. So here's a real question, and I'm not going to answer it for you. How many other things in your life right now, in your cabinet, in your fridge, in the car, in your driveway, got there because of a decision someone made in a boardroom you never got to vote on, backed by a study you never got to read? Let that sit for a second. If you've got a story, maybe your town got hit by this, maybe your family did, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and this is a channel where those stories belong. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real story behind the things that quietly run your life, subscribe. Hit the like button. It genuinely tells me you want to keep going deeper. And share this with someone who thinks they already know how the world works, because I promise they've never heard it told like this. Here's the last thing, and then I'll let you go. It started as a drop of white milk on a green pod, scraped off by hand in the dark before sunrise, 5,000 years before your country had a name. It ended up in the orange bottle behind your bathroom mirror, with your name typed on the label. That flower has outlived every empire that ever tried to own it. And the next time you snap that child-proof cap open, you'll know exactly what it took to put it in your hand. And you'll never be able to unknow it.